Obviously, Nicholas is not here, so I won't get you guys to read this. But like I said just a moment ago, Nicholas is asking a few questions here around about bracing. He finds himself with a few ambiguities when it comes to what is a brace, what does it mean, what's the correct way, etc., etc. And then he's asking, does bracing essentially differ between the squat, bench, and deadlift? And if so, how and why? And we will explain that. And then the last thing here, he mentioned something about where he should feel pressure underneath his feet when he's squatting. So let's just talk about the first one. Before we even talk about the brace, I just want to ask you, Kalen, as an example here, when you think of the brace, what comes to your mind?
The first thing comes to my mind is trunk expansion.
Okay, do you want to just elaborate on that one just a little bit?
Yeah. So, kind of I'm kind of thinking about, obviously that belt is really needs a nice piece of feedback as well. Full disclosure, I've only actually started using it recently because I actually had the money to buy one. So,
Yep.
but what I kind of really think about it, one, bracing is kind of, I guess, creating enough abdominal pressure in the body to actually be able to stabilize the trunk to lift said weight. That's kind of what I think about it. It just that can happen naturally, but if you're, I guess, intentionally lifting a really, really heavy weight, I guess there does need to be some sort of intent on bracing as well. So when I think about it, is kind of using that belt as some sort of feedback for my, I guess, my midsection just to kind of press into.
Okay. Okay. What about you, Chris? When you think of bracing, what comes to your mind?
Um, from I used to have the idea that bracing involves the intra-abdominal pressure
Right.
generally,
Yep.
but the more I've been in the sport and the more I've lifted, the more I've come to appreciate bracing as like a general term meaning getting your body ready to lift. So
Okay.
it's not necessarily just tied to the intra-abdominal pressure. It's more about understanding the lift, how you lift, and then how you get ready to execute that lift perfectly.
Yeah.
So, for
Cool.
example, my brace on the bench will be slightly different to my brace on the deadlift and my brace on the squat, just because um, positionally and movement wise, my body is required to move differently. So I can't brace universally for all three.
Right.
So
Yeah. No,
again, I,
that's
I'd, I'd say it's really just getting yourself ready for the lift,
Yeah, that's
whether
that's
it
a
means
that's a that's a good way of thinking about it. And I think like when we do talk about the braces, there's definitely a few components of the brace. It's not just a position, it's not just a breath, it's not just intra-abdominal pressure. There's definitely a few components to it, which is the reason why I think bracing itself gets a pretty complicated sort of rapport essentially. And so I just tried to simplify this one down at first instance, and I kind of just want to use the brace and coin these three things are the things that comprise that the brace is actually comprised of. So when I think of the brace, I think of three things. I think of position. When I talk about position, I'm primarily talking about the position of the rib cage and then the position of the pelvis, right? So if those two things aren't in a particular position that I'm intending them to be, then I'm going to have a bit of an uneven spread of pressure on the inside, going probably more towards the front part than the rear part. Because a lot of people think that when they breathe into the belt, breathe forwards, belly breathing, diaphragmatic breathing, if you will, the front part of the belly needs to kind of protrude and pop out. But that's not actually the case in point here. So the first thing is position. The second thing is volume. When I say volume, I'm literally talking about air volume. How much air can you get in and how much air do you need to get in? A lot of the times people also think that you need to take a massive, massive gulp of air. But in effect, the volume doesn't really matter as much because you actually need less air than you think. It's about what you do once you've taken the air in order to create the internal pressure within the cylindrical structure that is your trunk. Okay. So does anyone have any questions with that one so far? Cool. Is that anything different to what anyone knows so far? Cool. When we talk about
not really, it's just a good expansion.
Yeah. Okay. So when we talk about the three things, obviously I'm going to talk about the first thing. It's going to be position. When I talk about position, I'm talking about the thing that's known as the stack. Now, this is a perfect representation of a stack right here. Of course, with a skeleton that has no bones and doesn't live in the real world. When we try to adopt this position, people start to look pretty funny when they actually try to purposely do it. A lot of times we'll hear, and Nicholas mentioned in his comment, he said, sometimes people have told me to essentially brace as if I'm about to take a punch in. And in this case, what we then see is that the rib cage actually starts to go down a little bit more, right? And then we start to have a bit more of a down rib cage position, a little bit more of a posterior orientation of the pelvis. And then as a result of that, we've actually lost this stack position. The stack position is very familiar at this point in time in the SBD world in particular. And it's something that people are always like, you got to stack, you got to stack, you got to stack. Well, let me tell you something. First and foremost, if you're in a squat, and especially it's a low bar squat, it's really hard for you to stack. If you stack during the low bar squat, there is a high chance, right, that you can actually fold forwards. You have to actually go through the action of extending ever so slightly at the thoracic spine, the upper back, so that you hold this position so that the bar doesn't roll backwards or forwards. And by virtue, this actually defeats the purpose of the stack. It's really hard to hold the stack. Second thing, you go on the bench press, you lay down, you arch, right? You can't stack. And the arch actually in the bench press is the precise position that I don't want to see a body in if they're trying to maximize a brace or the internal pressure. So this position here is a good one. It's really easily achievable during the deadlift, a high bar squat perhaps. But other than that, it's not the easiest attainable one when it comes to actually squat, bench, and deadlift. But it is it's really good in theory. Does anyone have any questions with the stack? Cool. The second one, like I was saying before, is going to be the volume, and the volume is going. Yeah, go for it.
Sorry. Just to take you back.
Yep.
You mentioned something about the low bar. The
Yes.
low
Yep.
bar and
Yep.
back.
Yep.
So, essentially, if you have a very, what's the word I'm looking for? Acute torso angle.
To the forward, to like forwards.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
For if your lifter has a short torso and longer limbs.
Yep.
For example, that would mean that your torso angle would be a bit more leaning forward.
Yeah,
So
it would.
how would you balance out the torso, rather the extension, the thoracic extension?
Yep.
Vis-a-vis keeping a stack, basically.
Yeah. So
Without
what I'm suggesting, Chris, is that in fact, I'm not actually highly concerned about the stack, especially in a low bar position, regardless of limb architecture. I'm not caring too much about the stack, because the brace can be comprised of these three things. But as we're going to get a little bit further through the brace, sometimes we might not need to care about this. We might need to care about just this one, or we might need to care about these two, or we might need to care about these three. The squat in particular is one that I don't really care about the stack because it is a little bit hard to achieve. And I'd much rather be looking to do a bit more work from a volume and a pressure perspective.
Okay? Would that also, so because obviously, it's really hard to assume a stacked position in the low bar because of the hinge orientation you're going to be in, right? So there's going to be a little bit more. I'm assuming the ribs might be slightly a little bit more up, and the pelvis might be anteriorly orientated a little bit.
Yep.
Will that kind of also affect the strategies we use in terms of accumulating volume and pressure in particular directions?
It absolutely can. It absolutely can. But the caveat to that, Kalen, is that for history, we can still see extremely strong people right? Extremely strong people expressing really impressive feats of strength without even worrying about the stack position, right? So it's like you could look at Eddie Hall, for example, and he's not the best example, but he's one because everyone knows him and he's really strong. If you ever watched Eddie Hall squat, it's like that guy can't even achieve a stack, but he's got 400 kilos on his back. He is bracing, absolutely. So to answer your question there, Kalen, will not being in this quote unquote perfect stack have some sort of implication when it comes to volume or pressurization? Maybe, but I don't think it's something that we can actually measure in any sort of way. So long as we understand the principle behind internal pressurization, we can assume that just by that we're going to be doing a pretty good job, and we don't need to do anything more than that.
Okay, yeah, cool. So everything kind of takes care of itself in a way.
It can, so long as we abide by the principles of pressurization. So we'll get there
Yeah.
we'll get there in a minute.
Perfect. Okay.
So the next thing I was talking about was volume, and the volume is going to be accumulation of breath. Obviously, when we think about volume, we think about the lungs expanding. Kalen, which way does the diaphragm go when we inhale?
Down.
It goes down. So think about volume, diaphragm goes down, lungs expand. Now, I just wanted to kind of make a quick mention here is that obviously we want to take some sort of breath before we actually, quote unquote, brace and then do the actual lift itself, because the volume of air is going to provide the opportunity for pressure, right? But it's the amount of air that we kind of need to be a little bit mindful of here. The more air, it's like, I'll ask you another question, Kalen. If you take the biggest gulp of air, what will that do to your rib cage and maybe your position?
Well, it depends how I think about it, but if I'm just going to do it naturally, it's going to make my rib cage flare up a little bit, and I feel like my pelvis is going to orientate forward.
Right.
Slightly.
So when it comes to the stack, and I'm talking about the low bar, and I'm like, yeah, don't worry about too much about the stack. Yeah, I'm not saying completely neglect the stack. Like you want to have some sort of representation of a stack, but it's not going to be perfect, and it's allowed to be a little bit deviated, right? But anyway, case in point here is like if you take a massive gulp of air, it can start to influence the position of the rib cage, which can then just further take you away from that stack position, even that little one that you were trying to hold on to, right? So the little bit of air is going to be satisfactory. That doesn't mean an entire inhalation. It could mean like half of one, a quarter, or just like a little bit of a gulp of an air, pretty much. That's all that's required, right? Does anyone have any questions when it comes to volume of breath? No.
Quick one,
Yeah, go
Dennis.
for it.
Is it a factor really when you consider people who pass out on the deadlift, for example?
I don't think they're passing out because of hypoxia. They could be passing out for a whole host of different reasons. Is there more to that question?
No, that's just a general thought because
right. Louis, why do you think? Sorry,
I had a friend who passed out on a deadlift.
Yeah, yep.
And for the life of me, I couldn't figure out what exactly happened.
I'll just ask my good friend Louis here. Louis, is there something you could add to this one to help Chris understand why someone might pass out during a deadlift?
Yeah, look, it's not necessarily due to hypoxia in terms of they don't have enough oxygen, in their lungs, for example, but it's most likely due to some type of like blood pressure change in terms of you're lifting an extreme amount of weight. So your body is, I guess, to put it in another term, it's regulating pressures throughout our circulatory system to try and send as much blood as possible to those muscles that are trying to fire, while also trying to send as much to the vital organs to keep you alive at the same time. And eventually we do potentially have some reactions of, okay, cool, we need to stop because we're sending too much to those muscles where we need to keep it at the vital organs. And that sometimes does cause a chain reaction of blood pressure change and that for that person passing out. So part of it is just a natural mechanism to regulate blood pressure.
At first, you'd be like, well, wouldn't the brain say, hey, let me stop shuttling pressure to the muscles. I'll just like quit the lift essentially so that I survive, sort of thing. It's so funny how quickly that works and how little control we actually have of it. Because I would say in that instance, you know, I think the psychology even of the lifter wanting to do that task so desperately and dedicating every ounce, every shred of effort and ability to actually doing it, it's almost like by virtue of his psychology or their psychology to want to do this thing, that's why the muscles don't get turned off first. Maybe in this case, the brain gets turned off first. Again, this is just a hypothesis, but does that help answer that one, Chris?
It does, because he came to panting, like shock.
Yeah.
I was like, oh,
Yeah.
what's up? So he said he felt shortness of breath. So I was like, okay. So
Yeah.
we tried asking, how was your brace? Did you take in enough air? Or
Yep. So the air one's a good one, and this is probably this is the most important one, and this is going to be the pressurization. You know, everyone here probably knows what intra-abdominal pressure is, like IAP, right? You know, everything that the brace is ever thought of relates to pressurization of some sort. It's not about contracting the abdominals as if you're about to get a punch landed on you. It's not about just holding the stack. It's not about just taking a breath in. All of that, if you were to do all of those things and not think about pressurizing, they're just going to crumble and fall to bits, and they're completely redundant. Like without the pressurization, all of that means nothing. But all of that means absolutely everything should pressurization actually occur. Now, to understand pressurization, we might need to take a bit of a closer look at Boyle's law. So this is a very simple one, and if anyone's been following me for some time, you've probably seen this plastered on some of my posts before. Now, the first one up top here is a true representation of Boyle's law. So, you know, as we look at this thing right here, this little lever mechanism, if you will, that is going to be regulating pressure on the inside where this volume actually is situated. Of course, as this is getting pressured, pushed down, the space is closing. The volume hasn't changed, but the pressure is increasing. Now, if we were to flip this upside down and have this make any sort of sense to when it comes to bracing, this is what it's going to look like. As we take a breath in and we expand the lungs and we take in air, the diaphragm descends. Am I still right on that, Kalen? Right. So when we're inhaling and we take a breath in, great. We're maximizing space for volume and we're filling up that area with volume. The diaphragm is descending. We have not created any pressure yet. What we then want to do is actually close the mouth after we've taken that breath in. And then we want to force an exhalation. Not force it to the point where your jugular vein feels like it's actually going to pop out of your skin, but we want to initiate the action of an exhalation on a closed mouth. And what that's going to do, it's going to start to simulate this pressurization, because as you exhale, the diaphragm ascends. So now we have internalized pressure. Does anyone have any questions with this one? Kalen, is this anything different from what you know?
In terms of the bracing, I think it's a lot more nuanced as well, because I never really thought about it too much. Like I didn't exactly think about the mechanisms too much of it as well, but I think like that very subtle exhalation after you kind of take that, gulp of air as well, it's a very, I guess, subtle, but because that much is enough to kind of force the diaphragm to ascend back up. Like I think that is going. I realized that that's actually going to make a pretty big difference.
Right. So that's
pressure
that.
You make, yeah.
Yeah. So that diaphragm ascending as a result of the action of the exhalation is what's going to cause the internal pressure. Right. So it doesn't matter if it's a squat, bench press, or deadlift, the position you're in. If, you know, like we're talking about just before in low bar squat, it's really hard to maintain X position of a stack, for example. And the same thing applies for the bench press. But if both of those exercises we're able to take a gulp of breath in, close the mouth, act or initiate the action of an exhalation on a closed mouth, we're going to achieve pressurization. We're going to achieve the brace, if you will. And of course, when you achieve the brace and you achieve pressurization, you know, the expansion or the anterior expansion, as you were saying earlier, Kalen, will by virtue happen. But if it is just an anterior expansion and not posterior, i.e. circumferential, then there's obviously a bit of a misapplication or not misapplication, sorry. Then there's a bit of a diversion of pressure in different locations, which isn't overly something I'd be stressing about when it comes to the squat. Absolutely not the bench press. In fact, in the bench press, I want all the pressure to go up, which is quite hard because obviously, the air kind of wants to hang low. Whereas in a deadlift, we can absolutely maintain all three positions. When it comes to the bracing, because Nicholas asked, bracing and how it relates to the different exercises, this is what I was talking about. It's like in the squat, I care about pressure more than I care about volume and more than I care about position. Position is hard to attain in the squat, especially if it's a low bar squat. High bar front squat, a little bit different. The volume is, if anyone's had a really hard, heavy barbell on their back, the reason I say volume is because of this. If anyone's had a heavy barbell on their back, it is really hard to take in a big gulp of air. Extremely hard. Right, because the actions, the skeletal actions required for an inhalation are literally getting opposed by this barbell sitting on your shoulders. So it's hard to take the big breath in. So I don't worry about it too much. And that's why I suggest, you'd actually need a massive gulp. A gulp of air will suffice. But we do want pressurization. When it comes to the bench press, position is definitely not going to be achievable, i.e. that stack position, because of the arch, right? We want to maintain the integrity of the arch as stiff as possible. And as a result of that, we actually want to care about pressure and volume. Okay. When it comes to the deadlift, because by virtue of the deadlift, we can get into a position, we can actually maintain and hold a position and actually use the belt to help us hold that position by placing the belt on the lower ribs. We can actually take care of pressure, volume, and position. Does anyone have any questions with these? Cool. Is that anything new for you, Kalen?
I guess so. A lot of it's quite new because I never actually the fact that obviously your rib cage orientation, your pelvic orientation are extremely different on all three different lifts as well.
Sure.
So obviously I think this gives us a bit more of a more detailed understanding of what can we control and what should we control in terms of all the components of bracing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Just for the other guys, Jinesh, Bharat, and Chris, if you do have cameras, turn them on. It's a little bit weird just looking at your black screens. But of course, if you don't need to have, you can't have your camera on, that's totally fine. Do any of you guys have any questions so far with any of the bracing? Because that is pretty much that on bracing. All right, fantastic. There's only. Were you going to say something, Jinesh?
No. Okay.
Okay, cool. The next one that Nicholas asked was about squats and foot pressure. Now, I'm not going to cover too much about this one because I think this one here, by virtue, is going to actually explain a whole deal to us. Where should we be feeling pressure and all that kind of stuff? Chris, when you're squatting, where do you want to feel pressure underneath your feet?
I'd say midfoot, but more towards the rear foot, just because I feel strongest out of the hole driving back up.
Okay.
So I'd say midfoot balanced, but I'd prefer it more towards the rear than the front, if you will.
Yeah, I understand that. That might actually change when we actually look at your squat technique and make some changes to it. And you might actually stop using your hind foot so much. Louis, when you think about squats and foot pressure, what are you thinking about pressure underneath? Yeah, you might have to unmute yourself.
I think this picture is a good representation. I guess if we look at the loading and center of mass of this movement, let's just say the heaviest point essentially will be the bar eventually. You can look at the bar where on all three of those, in the front squat, the back squat, and even the low bar, is directly in that midfoot. So I guess we're looking for full foot pressure, but with a emphasis on center of mass over the foot to allow for a large amount of pronation.
Yeah. What about you, Kalen?
It really depends, but personally, obviously the midfoot as well. But then what I do kind of think is, I guess I guess your hips, especially to kind of move around space as well. I do feel like there needs to be subtle changes in foot pressure, especially as you descend. For example, I'm a high bar ATG at the moment. Kind of still I'm in that phase at the moment. So
Nice.
I think when it comes to especially high bar ATG, and while I'm trying to maintain like kind of a bit more of a neutral pelvic position as well, I do think it's important for me to sit back on my heels just a little bit, especially as I descend, to allow my hips to, I guess, sit more posteriorly. Otherwise, it's easier for me to create more room. But that's kind of what I think. It might completely change after what you say. So
I'm going to have that much influence that you're going to squat completely different from now on in. I'll tell you guys right now, when I squat, the last thing I think about is foot pressure. When I squat, I don't think about where I'm feeling pressure underneath my feet. And quite often, the complexity at which sometimes we bring to the SBD literally sends us into a rabbit hole of imaginative thoughts and hypotheses and theories that sometimes might actually be not overly helpful. The foot pressure itself is going to be entirely dictated by what Louis was saying, the placement of the load and then the placement of the center of mass. The load, the dumbbell, the kettlebell, the barbell, and the center of mass, i.e. the entire trunk here, they're always going to be working in harmony to keep you balanced. If they're not working in harmony, you're falling backwards or you're falling forwards and you're not actually squatting anymore. So by virtue, the body is going to keep you in a position where it needs to keep you. And you're going to feel pressures underneath your feet, depending on whatever you're doing, so that you don't fall over. There are definitely, like, for example, to get deep into a squat, we do want hind foot pressure. The hind foot pressure is going to be a little bit more expressive of what's called external rotation. And we actually need a full excursion of external rotation from top all the way to the hole to get nice and deep to achieve hip flexion. What then happens is, like what Caleb was saying, we might actually want to shift that pressure onto the midfoot as we actually internally rotate to pronate, to apply pressure into the ground to stand up. Now, this isn't something that we should be thinking about doing as we're squatting, because if we are, we've already kind of robbed ourselves an opportunity to squat well. The idea is to position the load and position your feet appropriately so that you can get either a full excursion of external rotation and hit the depth that you actually want to achieve. And then as you're going back up and you're pronating, internally rotating, applying force into the ground, you're positioned in an appropriate position where that's going to just naturally occur without you actually falling onto your forefoot, knees coming in, stripper squat, here we go, sort of thing. So, obviously, without seeing Nicholas's squat, I can't say where his feet are and exactly where the bar position is. But the idea for when Nicholas is listening to this, of course, is that as a general broad stroke, we want to be feeling pressure underneath the entire tripod of the foot throughout the entirety of the movement. There are going to be ever so subtle changes of pressure from the hind to the mid to the fore throughout the entire squat repetition. It's not something that you should be paying attention to. But if there are things that are starting to occur that are undesirable in the squat pattern, that's when we start looking at altering bar position. Because a high bar position, Kalen, isn't one specific position. There's probably like a 2-inch sort of spectrum of where you can actually move the bar for it to still quantify as a high bar. And the same thing applies for the low bar. A lot of people think, on the shelf of the rear delt. Yeah, but you can also go an inch lower and you can go an inch higher. So if the squat seems to be working and you're not seeing any problems when you're squatting, worry less about the foot pressure. If something is happening that is undesirable, that's when we start to look at foot position and bar position. Obviously, without Nicholas's video, we can't say anything there. But that's pretty much the broad stroke when it comes to foot pressure. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. Was that anything new to anyone?
Dennis, sorry,
Yeah.
I was trying to unmute. I recently switched to lifters from Vans, and it's made a difference.
Of course it would. And
Those
what difference has it
deflection.
made?
I don't know. I think I sent a video. There was a point when I was using the Vans, my rear foot would lift slightly, ever so slightly.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about planting it more.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
since I switched to lifters, I still feel like, yes, I focus more on planting, but like as you said, there's a distribution of pressure all through. So I'm
Yep.
still comfortable even
Yep.
going to depth.
Yeah. So Chris, when we get to actually your squats, you actually squat pretty narrow for your size. And as a result of squatting so narrow, you're able to go a little bit deeper, and that's why you're experiencing the butt wink, and that's why you're experiencing so much of the hind foot pressure, et cetera, et cetera. And that's probably why the lifters make a little bit more sense to feel better. But we will get to that one. Kalen, what's up? This is your question. Here we go. So let's dig into it. Kalen, do you just want to give us a little bit of context as to what you're asking here and
Yeah.
why?
So I'm talking more specifically about the setup. So before you actually lift the bar. So if you've seen a lot of elite powerlifters, some people brace, they kind of take some time to fill with the bar. They brace when they're ready in a flex position. Whereas a lot of people sometimes they look as if they grip and rip, but they actually brace before they actually grab the bar. So they brace in a more upright position and they come down into it. And coming into kind of my new block here, I've been playing around with a few different setups, and I used to kind of really take my time, like kind of filling with the bar and actually bracing while I'm already in flexion. Whereas nowadays, I've kind of started bracing in whilst I'm a little bit more upright.
Yep.
And yeah, I just kind of want a bit of insight on like how you think that might actually affect, I guess, well, just bracing in general. I think I might have a bit of a broad idea, although it's a little bit vague.
Yep.
After we've kind of gone through that, I guess that kind of talk about bracing before, but yeah, just kind of one of your ideas here.
I just want to get a bit of clarification from you. When you talk about are you familiar with Perform Motion from Australia here?
I've heard of the name actually, but
okay.
I think I live on the other side of the town.
Okay, they're just like they're a boutique powerlifting sort of gig here in Australia, and they do things very, very different to the traditional sense. And I think the reason I'm asking is because I'm asking whether or not you're looking at that as a representation of bracing before the lift, whilst in the upright position. Just to confirm here, you know when people like setting up for a deadlift, and it's like before they've even bent over to get the bar, they're like shoulders back and down, get really, really tight, brace, and then they're pretty much braced, and then they lean over and pick the bar up. Is that what you're talking about?
It could be. Like how I do it is just I do kind of like lean over a little bit nowadays, but I do try. Obviously, it's kind of the intention to stay long and whatnot, but it is a bit more of I do assume a bit more of an upright position compared to how I did before. So it's still a little bit more kind of hunched over in a sense.
Sure. We'll dig into it. Because obviously my interpretation of the initial question may have been a little bit different to what you intended. We'll cover it, and then we'll see if we can go through a little bit more. So as a general thing that I'm going to say here, when it comes to bracing for the deadlift, should you brace in a more upright position? Should you brace in a more, I guess, ready to pull position sort of thing? The more mass you have, Chris, you're a big dude. How flexible and malleable are you? Chris is like, I can do the squats, the splits. No, seriously, are you a bit of a stiff person?
Not quite. I'm okay, stiffer than anyone lighter than me, but generally more mobile than people my weight.
Your size, yeah, because you're strong and you train, you can actually control your body. You'd be stiffer than Kalen, that's for sure. If you haven't seen Kalen, follow him on Instagram. He was doing this. I think he was doing the splits today. Was that you, Kalen?
That was a while ago.
Okay.
That last session was like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah. So when it comes to bracing in the deadlift, the more mass you have, the more stiffness you're going to be expressing. The more stiffness. And what I'm talking about stiffness, I'm talking about a few different things. I'll keep it simple and talk about two things right now. I'm talking about stiffness on the posterior side of your body, meaning that, the upper back could be a little bit arched in this circumstance. The muscles on the posterior side of the trunk are a bit shorter in a more concentric orientation. And I'm also just talking about literally just muscle tension in that area as a result of it. What this can then start to imply is that our ability to go through larger or just, full ranges of motion can actually be more challenging than not. Whereas if we have someone who is of a leaner stature, less mass perhaps, they are absolutely, or they have at least more potential to be malleable, so that, they're actually malleable. They can move and reposition themselves appropriately. Now, I wanted to kind of say these two things, Kaylin, because this is the differentiator between should you, brace upright or brace in a start flex position. I guess we can kind of go from here. This is obviously just a video of me lifting, and it is by no means overly impressive. It's 260 kilos in the bar, and I just want to show you guys how I actually brace for the deadlift. So I'll bend over, I'm in this position, and then I'm bracing and I'm going. Now, Kaylin, is that different to what you're doing right now?
Yeah, so if you kind of look at my recent Instagram, I kind of like, obviously, like, we like to keep ourselves long, so we kind of hunch over a little bit as we set up, and I brace there, and then I go down, grab the bar, and lift.
Right, fantastic. Whereas for me, I'm a pretty lean person. Like, I'm not actually that mass wise. Okay. So my brace actually starts from around about here. My feet are in position, my hands are in position, my hips are back. I'm in a position where I'm actually organizing my rib cage and my pelvis here. I'm going to take a breath in, bring my knees forward, and go straight away, right? So this is my ability to do that. And when I see big dudes do that, they will just kind of literally shift the bar away from them because they're trying to find some room for them to actually initiate and actually fill their trunk up with air. So that's obviously different to what you're doing, Kaylin. And we both find ourselves on the lean mass sort of spectrum. The other thing was going to be Eddie Hall, fantastic. Obviously, lots of mass. And Eddie is also finding himself in this position here, but he won't actually brace until that point. See how he like rolls back? He'll like roll the bar forward, sit himself back, and then brace and go. And of course, again, that's because he has zero malleability to actually get into this position to begin with. Like, he's got to do the whole rolling forwards and backwards to get himself and organize himself in a position where he can actually feel like he's in a decent position to initiate a brace, essentially. So, obviously, like I said before, Kaylin, my interpretation of your question was a little bit different. Where can we go from here?
No, it's not too much. I'm not like exactly trying to find like the correct one. I'll just kind of like really more curious about different bracing strategies for obviously people of different body compositions, different mass, different weight classes whatsoever. So I think that kind of covered the bases of it in terms of like, I guess, like, where do you start to brace? How do you kind of like how do you find your position before you brace? Or do you find your position after you brace, for example? I think it wasn't more about whether it was right or wrong. I was just kind of like curious.
Right.
About...
Me personally, I'd be doing everything to be in position before I brace. And when I say be in position, I'm talking about this. Like, this is in position. My hands are there. My feet are there. I'm not moving my feet anywhere, right? I'm in position to start bracing. Me doing this is just initiating the pull. Like, because my position technically hasn't changed. Yes, my hip has changed in location, but it was like, it wasn't going to go any different place on the basis that my hands and my feet were already here. So, I can absolutely visualize, Kaylin, what you're talking about, and I will have a bit of a look on your Instagram and have a look, and we can kind of discuss a little bit further there. The benefit to, say, for example, hovering over the barbell in that sort of, degrees of knee and hip flexion, you're hovering there, arms long, you're quote unquote stacked. Is this right, Kaylin?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, your arms are long, hanging, and you're bracing here, and then all you're doing is literally just bending your knees a little bit more to get your hands on the bar, and then off you go.
Exactly. Couldn't
Right,
describe it better. Yeah.
Right. And so that's just like a very, very good way of, remember how just a few slides ago we were talking about the deadlift, where the deadlift, we want to care about pressure and volume and position. So
Exactly. Yeah.
in the deadlift, we can actually do this. So by you actually starting in that position, Kalen, you're doing this, you're able to do this, you're able to do this and this. You know what I mean? Because that's what we
Yeah.
want to deadlift. So that's a good one. But that's not to say that in this position, I'm not doing the same thing. In this position here, I'm doing the position thing, I'm doing the breath thing, and then I just start doing the pressurization thing. So it's like a much for muchness. Maybe perhaps people find it with, if they start in your position, hover, brace, grip, and then go, they might hold that position better. But look, man, when the bar gets heavier, that position ain't holding. It's going to change. There's going to be a degree of change. You know what I mean? So
Yeah, of course.
it could be a hyperfixation on something that might not have too much benefit. But
Yeah.
if it feels good, man, and it's working for you, don't let me tell you not to do it.
Yeah. Again, it was just kind of me playing around anyway. It's not to say that like the previous thing didn't work. It was more like because I'm not actually signed with USAPL at the moment, and I'm planning to soon. So I just thought it was probably a good idea for me to kind of play around and just see what feels, I guess, comfortable. Maybe not beneficial, but just what feels comfortable for me in the end. So
yeah, absolutely, man.
Yeah.
I just feel like in the position that I'm in, for example, where I'm not hovering. When you're hovering, there's I guess quad tension. It's almost like this little reminder to keep tension on the quads because you're about to start using them and you want to actually use them to initiate the push. Whereas what I find myself, it's like, you know when people talk about wedging in the sumo?
Yeah.
Well, it's pretty hard to wedge in a conventional, but there is like this sensation of me just like wedging myself into the bar when I'm actually in this position. And you can kind of see it, like I'm here, breathe, brace, wedge, off I go sort of thing. So yeah, much for muchness, man. But
Yeah, for sure.
yeah. All right.
Because I was about to ask whether it really matters on the sumo as compared to the conventional.
Does what matter?
Just the setup. What you're discussing earlier. Whether you hover, because I found that I hover on sumo, but on conventional I set up pretty much like you. Like I'll set my hook first, then go through the motions. But on sumo, I'll start pretty braced. So I'm just descending crane-like and lifting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes lifters start to express idiosyncrasies that they've seen other people do, like the very slow hover over the conventional or the very slow hover in the setup of the sumo, slowly going down sort of thing, for not much return, or at least they're doing it. And if someone was to ask them, hey, tell me exactly why you're doing that, the answer you'd get, you'd probably be left thinking, okay, so you don't actually have to do that. Like, it doesn't provide any additional benefit. It's just a different way. Like I was saying, for example, the hovering in the sumo even is definitely going to cue people to keep their arms long and keep their quads on. You know what I mean? It's like this internal cue to yourself, really. Does it imply anything? Is it going to get you into a better position? Maybe, because by hovering over the conventional and the sumo, you're going to go down and, essentially get your hands on the bar slower, which means that you might be a little bit more deliberate with what you do with your position. So again, it might even be something that people do just so they can, be very finesse, so to speak, with their start position. All right. Does that help, Chris?
Yeah, it does. It does.
Yeah, cool.
It's just I don't really think of it beyond doing what I need to do to lift.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that until there are some problems. All right, Bharat, unmute yourself. Here we go. This is a big question. So can you, obviously I know what it is. Can you just quickly summarize this and give us a bit of context as to what you're asking?
Yeah. So the first part of the question, I was really curious about how do you spot a difference in technique for a lifter? Like how can you help him with a better technique? Like earlier, I used to do a jolt style bench press where when the bar touches my chest, I'll keep it on my chest and then jerk with my legs and push the bar up. Then recently, I changed my coach and he said that a soft touch type of bench would be more suited for me, and it's really helping me nowadays. Like
Oh,
my bar is coming down, my arc is increasing, my legs are all fired up because of the leg drive, and I touch my bar very slightly on my chest, and then I push the bar up. So, and the first part I was curious, like how do you spot, like can you help a lifter with a technique which is better for him?
absolutely. Cool.
And second part is, I guess you already covered that in the first slide of Lewis, I guess, for the foot pressure part. Like, is it important to feel the whole foot or not? And where are you supposed to feel like my heel was rising, and I guess Chris has the same problem with his squat. That his back part of the rear part of the foot rises up while squatting, and
Absolutely.
I'm facing the same problem with it. But and I somehow feel like if I get more pressure behind my heel, like on heel, I could squat more weight up. Is
Yep.
that so? That was the second part of my question.
Yeah. Cool. I remember last time we spoke, you had some issues with your squat and you were talking about ankle mobility. Because I haven't got any videos of you squatting, it's very hard for me to say much. But when we get to that point, we'll talk a little bit more about it. Who is your coach, by the way? Hello. Who is your coach? All right. Can everyone else hear me? Or have I gone silent?
Oh, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay, no worries. Maybe
No,
you
I
can't
can
hear
hear
me. Okay, I'll move on then. Okay. The syncing of the bar is a very it's an interesting strategy, and it works for some people depending on your position, right? Depends on several things of your position. The slow t-shirt-esque sort of bench press that you are doing, the slow eccentric control of the barbell, the soft touch is a really, really good option for most people. And like you were saying, as a result of you slowing down and having more eccentric control of the barbell on the way down, it's forcing you, it's putting you in a circumstance where your body has to do things, i.e. maintain leg drive, foot pressure, and arch, which is fantastic. All these things have a pretty large sum contribution to your ability to use your body, so to speak, as a springboard to then actually press the bar. So keep doing what you are doing. But as a very, very general rule of thumb here, this is kind of how we can actually look at it. A high arch, right? A high arch. If you have a high arch and you have narrow hands, either widen your hands or stop arching. It's an entirely like mismatched sort of a thing that you're doing. But typically speaking, a high arch is going to come with wider hands. Now, if you're arching high, Bharat, if you can hear me, if you have a big arch and you let the barbell sink, what does that do to your arch?
I guess I'll just go down
Yeah,
and
it drops it. It doesn't matter how much leg drive you have, the barbell is going to be heavier. It's going to have more influence on the rib cage than your leg drive. So dropping the barbell, sinking it when you're in a high arch position with wide hands is completely inefficient. It also means that, you've adopted this high arch wide hand position because you're trying to maximize how much time you spend in what's called internal rotation, the force production place that we want to live in as powerlifters. Essentially, you've adopted this position to do that, to maximize your performance, and then you let the bar sink. The rib cage drops. As a result of the rib cage dropping, now the bar travels a further distance, which means that the humerus, the arm bone, travels a further distance. It goes into external rotation because it goes lower and deeper because of the sink. And now you have to do more work over time to actually overcome that barbell. So that was a pretty big tangent. I apologize. But a high arch, wider hands, no sinking, right? when we have an arch that's not high, but it's not like flat, like it's an arch, you could look at it and be like, that's an arch, but it's not impressive. Then we're looking at wide hands, not wider hands, wide hands. So as a result of that, we're still looking at the same thing here of no sinking. When we have a low arch, we're going to have narrow hands because there's no point having wide hands if we have no arch. Then we're looking to utilize the sinking strategy. Okay. Does anyone have any questions?
Like you said in the third part of the slide, is low arc equals to narrow hands and sink. So this is what I was doing earlier. Like I had no arc in my back and my grip was pretty much very narrow. And
Yeah.
I used to do the sink part as well. But
Yeah.
somehow I see that that was not working for me well. Like I was feeling more powerful. I was able to generate more power with this stance, but obviously I feel much stronger with wider hand. So like, how do you get to know about this? Like, how can you differentiate that this narrow hand sink style is for you, or wide hands no sink is better for you?
Yeah. Am I here? No, hang on. So I just want to remind myself what these videos for and if they could actually be used to answer your question right now. So you're asking here, like, how would you know if you should have an arch or no arch, and if you should have wide hands or narrow hands? Right. Unfortunately, there's no blueprint to bench pressing or powerlifting or lifting in general. And the best thing we can do is hypothesize here. Now, who's going to be better suited to someone who has a high arch than wider hands and sinking is going to be the person that can arch. Right? If there's a person that can't arch, and I'll tell you right now, I can't arch very well because arch requires thoracic extension. I live in a permanent state of thoracic extension. I'm already there all the time. I'm a powerlifter. I'm what's called posteriorly compressed. My rib cage is kind of flared. I've got an arch in my back almost all the fucking time, right? And so when I then have to go on a bench press and arch further, it's like I can't arch further because I'm already there. So I have a horrible arch. Like I have a really hard time having an arch. Some people aren't like that. You know what I mean? And that can actually affect a really, really nice arch. And as a result of that, that's the differentiator. Can you arch? Yes. Fantastic. Let's actually try maximizing your arch. Then let's try adopting 2 different strategies of foot position to maximize the arch. Now let's go wider hands. You fit that criteria. If you ask someone, if I ask you about, hey, can you arch and you're arching your back and it's like fucking flatter than this ruler, then I'm going to be like, all right, Mad, I'm not going to take you 40 steps back to change your shape so that you can arch better. I'm just going to go, Mad, we're just going to go, to a degree, flat back, small arch. We're going to manipulate foot position. We're going to go a little bit narrow with the hands and we're going to let you sink. And that's going to be the differentiator. Can you arch? Can you not arch? It's literally, I don't want to sound reductionist here, but it's that simple. It doesn't have to be any complicated than that. Does that give you something to think about, bro?
Yeah, actually, it's much more clearer now. But I have seen some lifters over in Instagram that first of all, they're very huge and they have nice arch, but they still do the sink style bench with wide hands. And
yeah.
It's working for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And they'll sink, they'll let it sink, and then like they'll almost kind of let their hips drop as well, and then they'll use it as like a bit of a trampoline sort of thing. Right. The reason why you would want to do that is if that is a practiced skill. Like that's a refinement of sinking strategy. Right? So when I say low arch is narrow hands, I'm not saying that you have to only have narrow hands when you have no arch. Like you can have an arch and still go narrow hands. And like an arch and narrow hands might be actually something we might see with people who have short arms. They can have a massive arch and short arms. Technically speaking, their hands are going to be narrower. So the people that you're seeing on Instagram, the first question is going to be, how long are their arms relative to their torso? Now, is that why they're going narrow hands? On the next case, if someone has a really, really good arch and they have long-ish hands and they're going narrow, I'm going to say that not many of those people exist on Instagram at a high level either, because that is just a very inefficient way of doing things. Because like I said before, what you're doing as a result of that is you're forcing yourself to travel a larger distance of a repetition, essentially, which means that you have to do more work over time. Now, when it comes to powerlifting or lifting the most amount of weight possible across the SBD, that is not the aim of the game. The aim of the game is to shorten the distance possible to lift the most amount of weight possible, right? So can you see how that might be a mismatch there?
Sure.
Yeah. Jinesh, fantastic. You're on show finally. So I just took I just took some videos here. This is me bench pressing. As you can see, there's no arch, and I've got a relatively wide hand placement. If you guys met me in person, my wingspan is literally like my body length, maybe even a little bit more. Even it's ridiculous. If I could actually have my hands on the collar, I would, because that would be so much more comfortable and I'd be so much more stronger. But anyways, here I am as a representation of a wide hand, a small arch-ish. Bharat, do you look at this and do you think of this as sinking?
Yeah, I think it's sinking.
Is it
Like,
sinking? Is it sinking or is it inefficient?
more of inefficient, I guess. That you're losing your leg drive when you keep the bar on your chest. Right?
I am losing my leg drive. You're absolutely right. But how do you know that I'm losing my leg drive?
I see your knees falling downwards when you keep the bar on the chest.
Yeah,
And
so the knees go forward, sort of thing. Yeah, of course, of course. Now, these are the things that I put this video on purpose, not because my bench press here is any good. My bench press right here is actually horrific. I put it for a reason, because there are also some things that we might not understand. For the last 18 months, right? Do you guys know what a subscapularis muscle is?
Internal rotator, right?
Right. So it's an internal rotator. Mine is completely detached at the insertion point. And that is one thing that I actually require, use of as I'm actually, as the bar is maybe say 2 or 3 inches away from the chest on the eccentric and the concentric. My ability to control the bar when it gets to around about here, see how it just drops? I have zero control of it. I can't control it. It feels like someone's stabbing me in the shoulder with it, right? So when we look at Instagram and we look at people doing stuff, people would look at that and hypothesize all these inefficiencies. And it's like, hang on a second. In some circumstances, maybe like we don't even actually know why this is happening. I haven't been able to progress my bench press in a while because of this. And I'm forced to be into this sink position. I hate it, right? It's horrible. But then we have a video here of Jinesh, Jinesh, do you have any shoulder pathologies?
I used to use mixed grip on deadlifts. My right shoulder doesn't like it, so there's a little bit of pain from that.
Okay, but you don't have like torn muscles, tendons, ligaments?
No. Nothing
Okay,
else.
fantastic. We've then got a perfect representation of I'm not going to say this is a flat back, but it's pretty close to a flat back, and it's definitely not an arch, and a narrow grip and a sinking. What do you think about this one, Bharat? Is there any leg drive here?
Yeah, I see leg drive after the second part of the lift is done. Like he
So
bends
on the concentric, there's leg drive. Is anyone else noticing anything here in this lift? Why is he sinking? Do you need me to play it again? Can anyone have a guess? Anyone? Why is he sinking?
At hazard, I guess that he has the mass to sink.
Say that again, sorry.
I'm saying, if I was to hazard a guess,
Yep.
It's because he has the mass to sink. Similar to my style of benching, I can soft touch, but I have the mass to sink.
Oh, sorry. Okay, he has the mass to sink. Interesting.
Yes.
We haven't even spoken about mass yet. That's a good one.
he can
Fantastic.
sink. I guess he can sink because he has like you said, no arc, very close to flat bench type of thing going on. Like he has no arc, so he
Right.
can sink, he will not lose any range of motion in this of stability.
Right. So because he has a flat back and a narrower hand position, that is a very large distance that he has to cover from top to bottom. Look at this. That's huge. That is such a large distance, right? Now, the body is smart. The brain is really, really smart. The brain is always looking at it for opportunities, right, to take the path of least resistance. Right? That's the entire premise behind biomechanics, essentially. And a sinking strategy, what we find when people have a flatter back and narrow hands, is that they're instinctively going to sink to use as a bit of a springboard to actually make this whole thing a little bit easier. Right?
Okay.
So, unless Janesh actually is purposely sinking for any particular reason, that's why we can probably see a sink here. So, Bharat, obviously that was like a bit long-winded. Did that help you?
Yeah, sure did. Sure.
Go.
I actually had one more question, not
Yep.
Related to this bench or my squatting video.
Yep.
I asked you later that what is the right amount of trade-off between explosiveness and losing form when it comes to deadlift?
When it comes to deadlift?
What is the right amount of trade-off between explosiveness and technique?
Yeah. You know, the better the technique, the better like position and technique to me are like kind of one and the same. And the better the technique, the better the position, the more potential for explosiveness. So if someone's being explosive, and we'll see actually in Janesh's video later, because Janesh has a behavior on the bench, squat, and deadlift where he is trying to be explosive on everything, and it makes everything harder for him. But if you're trying to be explosive when your position is, I guess, improper in the deadlift, so to speak, then firstly, your potential to be explosive is nowhere near as what it actually could be should you be in a good position. So if you know, and if you've worked diligently to get yourself into a good position in the deadlift and your technique is sound, then explosiveness is going to be expressed naturally. And then, so, in that instance, there's no trade-off. They work hand in hand with one another, right? But if you've been explosive without position, not very helpful.
But sometimes, like when I get very explosive, think of getting explosiveness during my deadlifts, I see that I lose my technique and my lower back arcs. You know what I'm trying to say? But how do you get efficient with proper technique and your explosiveness goes hand in hand?
Can you say that second part again? Sorry.
I was asking like how to get efficient with technique and explosiveness both at the same time, so that we can get right amount, like maximum amount of explosiveness with a proper technique when performing a deadlift.
Yeah. Okay. The thing is that, like I just said before, explosiveness is going to be expressive when technique is good. If your technique is not very good, you might think you're being explosive and you might feel like you're being explosive, but you're not actually being as explosive as what you could be if your technique was good. Right. So if you're being explosive, Bharat, and you know that position is being compromised and technique is not very good because of it, you're actually robbing yourself of potential here. I would think less about trying to be explosive all the time, and I would think more about getting better at a position or a technique, so to speak, right? Because of that, you're not even going to have to think about being explosive in the future. You're going to be explosive because the deadlift, or the technique in this case, is a skill. It's a manipulation of the body in certain. I just lost my train of thought here. You're positioning your body in different positions and locations so that the right things can occur. This is called intra and intermuscular coordination alike. Right? When those two things are able to be expressive, then full maximal muscular contribution, neural contribution will come with it.
So, like, can we say that explosiveness is just a byproduct of your technique? Like, if your technique is efficient, and then explosiveness will just come to you while performing.
Yeah, it will. It can. Explosiveness is still something that you have to intuitively think and actually do, right? But it will come with technique. Yes. Does anyone have any sort of ambiguities with what I'm saying here?
If I may interject,
Yeah,
what I'm understanding here is that explosiveness, like, obviously isn't like, what I'm getting out of this is like, it's not necessarily like just kind of like one strict quality. You have explosiveness as like just kind of like, you know, how much force can you exert over a short period of time, right? But I guess it's also about like the application of explosiveness as well. And I guess like the way we apply it, if we apply explosiveness incorrectly as well, like let's say in a deadlift, if your force isn't directed like up, you know, if your positioning isn't correct, then obviously when your positioning goes off, then the amount of force you can create in the correct direction and using the correct orientation is going to go down as well. So
yeah, that's exactly what we're saying here. Yeah, but right, does that give you some more?
Yeah, got it. Thanks, Kyle.
So what are you going to do from now, Bharat, with your technique?
I'm just gonna, focus on not compromising my form and thinking of getting the right amount of explosiveness, not just, go barbarian on it.
Barbarian. Yeah, exactly. Get good at it, and then you'll be better at it. Okay.